Morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our virtual leader chat on National Indigenous Peoples Day. Today's guest, Jessie Wente, an Ojibwe writer, broadcaster, and advocate for Indigenous rights. He is well known for his 22 years as a columnist on CBC's Metro Morning and is also a chairperson of the Canada Council of the Arts and an executive director of Indigenous Screen Office. Welcome, Jessie. So now on to today's virtual leader chat. As you all know, Carla is on the line. So if you have any questions as Jessie and I are dialoguing, please send them into Carla and she will pop on and answer your questions. So Jessie, most recently, the discovery of a mass grave with the bodies of 215 children on the site of former Kamloops Indian Residential School has caused many of us to acknowledge this painful truth about Canada's history. And we've also been going through not only the pandemic, but almost a reckoning here in Canada. And I think we mentioned to you before, we do have a connection with the Kamloops Indian Residential School in light of one of our virtual leader chat guests, Chief Manny Jules, who we've done work with their chief commissioner and the tax commission. When he did our virtual leader chat with us back on Orange Shirt Day in October, it was very close to where that burial site was. His parents were at the residential school and he was in the day school there. So it's close to home in many ways for us. And I guess I wouldn't mind opening it up with you. You know, with all that's been coming to light in recent weeks about our history with the residential schools, the impact of generations of injustices on Indigenous peoples, what can non-Indigenous Canadians do to help support the Indigenous communities?
Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for the question and for having me here. I'm wearing my orange shirt today because it seemed appropriate. You know, I think there's a couple of things in what you said. You know, I think there's because there's ultimately there's two parts to truth telling. There's the telling of the truth and there's the accepting of the truth. And I think for Indigenous peoples, I think the sense is that the truth has been told a lot. And maybe what we're seeing in this past little bit is finally maybe some acceptance of that truth. Not totally. We're still, you know, we still see lots of discussion, perhaps, or debate, as it's often referred to in the media, about these things. And so when you said, you know, Canadians are sort of acknowledging that, I think that's actually really important. And maybe the first thing non-Indigenous people can do is accept the truth, even as hard and as painful, I think, as we all realize that is and may be. And I say maybe because, you know, even since the I don't call it a discovery, I call it a confirmation that happened in what's now called Kamloops. There's been others at other residential schools across the country. We know there will be more. And so I think one of the things that, you know, I've been saying to people, and I'll say here this morning, is part of why it's important to accept the truth is so Canada can be prepared for what is coming, let alone what has already passed. Because we know that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission estimated that there was more than 4,000 unaccounted for children. And our communities have long stated that we know there are children that never came home, that the families don't know what happened to them. And we know that there were graves on the sites of these schools. And I think what makes the sting of this particular moment hard for Indigenous communities, but I think increasingly for non-Indigenous communities in Canada, which is that we're also pointing out that this was known then. So I'll give you an example. You know, my family went to the residential schools in Spanish Ontario There were two schools there. There was they were both at times called St. Joseph's School, one for girls, one for boys. And a lot of Anishinaabe kids from as far away as Thunder Bay would have been sent there. So my family, well, my dad's side of the family is from Chicago and is very American. My mom's side of the family comes from Acknowledgements, which is the Serpent River, for what's now called the Serpent River First Nation on the north shore of Lake Huron. So my great grandparents, Alex and Maggie Miyawasaki, they actually chose to send their kids to the school in Spanish because they, the way it was pitched to them, they had already converted to Catholicism by that point. They were quite devout in their faith. And they saw the schools as an opportunity to send their kids to learn these new things, these new ideas and new sort of ways of knowing and being. I think they recognized, my great grandparents lived off the land. They had been trappers and farmers. He was the chief. She was the midwife of the community. He had, sold furs to Hudson Bay Company. But they also knew all of that was disappearing. And so they were very intent on, well, let's prepare our children to live in this new world and learn English and learn the ways of the newcomers, and really ideally sort of set forth and become successful. They even wanted their children to intermarry, to just, they had 8 kids, Alex and Maggie, including my grandmother, Norma. 5 of the kids, the oldest 5, attended the schools in Spanish. But then, after the 5th went, my grandparents figured out that good things were not happening at the schools. And, there's a lot of reasons why it took that long. I wasn't alive. This is the 20s or the 30s. I was very long from being here. But what happened is they moved off the reservation entirely to protect the 3 youngest children from the residential schools. And because they knew the Indian agent would not come to see them, and that's who came to take the children. And it's important for Canadians to understand that in 1920, there was a law passed. So residential schools were established in Canada, actually first by the church before even Canada existed, before there was a Canada. They were institutionalized into Canadian law with the passing of the Indian Act, which occurred in 1876. So Canada at that time was only 9 years old. Okay, they passed it in 1920. There was a bunch of amendments that aren't particular to residential school. The big one that affected residential schools in 1920, they amended the act to make it mandatory for all First Nations children to attend residential school. Interesting date, 1920, because if you look, as I have, at government records, you can find a report from 1920 about the schools in Spanish Ontario. And in that report, it says a couple of interesting things. It notes or questions why the schools were located in a boggy and marshy region next to the lake. And it asks or raises the question of why there are so many graves in the cemetery that was constructed next to the schools. This is a report to the government in their own records from 1920, the year they made sure that my grandmother, some 14 years later, would be forced to attend those very schools that had so many graves in the cemetery. By the way, they don't answer in the report why there were so many graves in the cemetery. But the point is that when we accept the truth, part of it is accepting that, yeah, this happened, even though the last school only closed in 1996, which is when Seinfeld was on the air, just so people understand. We often think of these things as happening a long time ago, and by people that are not somehow related to us, although I can tell you these people, these were my family. I grew up with this in my house. But we also imagine that these were decisions made by political people from long ago. But the reality is they knew in 1920 they had reports, and they actually knew even before then. But they know, at least for my community, in 1920 there were already questions about why there were so many graves in the cemetery. Then what the part of the acceptance is that subsequent governments did not investigate or do anything to solve this. Right? So it's not just about the folks who instituted the schools. It's the fact that for pretty much the entirety of Canadian history, as its history as a nation, not much was done about it. And these are not, you know, when we tell truths, especially uncomfortable ones, there's always a reaction and there's always a feeling, because these are ultimately about feelings a lot of the time. There's a feeling that we don't want it to be true and we don't want to accept it. We all know, I'm sure we've all are somewhat familiar with the idea of the cycles of grief, right? That we grieve in a pattern, right? And it ends with acceptance of the grief. And so part of what I think we're struggling with, and when I say we, I'm very much using a very broad we, because I think for our communities, we're sort of experts at reconciliation, because these are truths we've had to reconcile for a very, very long time. It's the rest of Canada that has not been forced to reconcile these truths. And I think that's the process we're in, and it is a grieving process. That's why I say reconciliation is really not for Indigenous people, it's for non-Indigenous people, because you need to reconcile that this is the truth. You need to accept it, acknowledge it, and work from that new reality in terms of how we understand this country, our relationship, and what we do now to do those things. For us, this is healing. We're trying to heal as communities. These are open wounds that get hurt every time there's a new confirmation, but they're not new wounds. These are known for us. So we're in a healing process. And so I think, and you know, so we're on a different stage of grief, I would suggest, than the rest of Canada, which is in a combination of the very early stages. I don't think we've got to the acceptance point yet, when you still have newspapers and politicians who are all too willing to outright deny that these things were bad, or that they were, you know, I see publications saying, oh, it was normal for children to die at school. It was not normal for children to die at school in 1920. I'm sorry to say. Please go back and read any history books. If there were mass graves at all schools in Canada at 1920, maybe we can consider that a norm. But we know, as it turns out, the schools that my children attend in the city, none of them were built with graveyards next to them, right? They knew what the outcomes were going to be. They knew that death was going to happen. And we know that subsequent governments didn't do much about it. If they didn't end the schools, they didn't really investigate. Again, there is no answer to that question in the government's own report about why there were so many graves in the cemetery next to the school my family went to. So I think I have a lot of empathy for Canadians who are at a different stage in their grieving process, who may be lashing out, wanting to deny it, wanting to, you know, because again, go look up the early stages of grief. That's all that happens. But we do need, to circle back to your question, Nicole, what can we do? Work through that grief and get to the acceptance part of what this is, because our communities need Canadians to actually have this conversation in a rational, truth-based way, where we can just acknowledge that this happened, and we can accept it and have it sit with us, so we can actually start building. I don't know, reconciliation, I've always struggled with that word, because it suggests the rebuilding of a functioning relationship. I think we actually have to start sort of at ground zero again, or ground one, which is, let's start. I don't know if the relationship we have can be repaired, is what I guess I'm saying. And I think instead we need to actually talk about a new relationship, and one that starts And yes, we can all be filled with regret that this should have happened originally. It didn't. So we live in the now. So that means that part of what Canada has to do is come to grips with what it has done and work to actually make amends and move forward. That's ultimately what reconciliation is. And that is going to require, before we can even talk about a relationship, think about your own personal relationships when someone has wronged you. And again, keep in context the wrongs that we're talking about here, because on an interpersonal level, I've never had anyone wrong me on the level that Canada has wronged my community. And so in that context, there's probably steps before we can actually even begin to get to that part about discussing what the relationship is. A lot of stuff probably has to happen. There's the accepting of the truth. There's probably more telling and more accepting of that has to happen. And then honestly, I do think we have to talk about reparations, like amends being made before we can discuss. And amends in this sense is, we shouldn't shy away from the fact that that is probably both political, economic, social. That's the depth of the amends that has to be made. But the output of that is a different Canada, but maybe one we can all, because I know there's hashtags floating around about canceling Canada Day, the upcoming Canada Day. Maybe if we can actually form a Canada based on truth and accepting of the truth, we can get to one where we don't have to talk about canceling a day of celebration.
Canada Day.
Yeah, like we can actually get to a place where we will all celebrate it. I just think we're not at that place right now, and I can't say it's going to be easy. These weeks have not been easy for our community. They have not been easy, I hope, for Canada. And I say that I hope because we do need Canada to share some of the hard part of this. There's the way I've put it in other places is Canada comes with a burden. But it's a burden that is not shared equally. And it's a burden that was expressly placed on some so that others would not feel it. And I think we're at a moment where what we really need to happen is for everyone to carry the burden of Canada in a way, frankly, that First Nations people have carried more than our fair share for a long time. I don't know of more communities, any communities that have given more to Canada than ours. And I guess what we're saying now is, what exactly have we received in return for all that we have shared with the nation that calls itself Canada? That's it. That's a long answer to the first question. I'll try to be less verbose.
No,
this is my thoughts.
No, Jessie, thank you. And first of all, thank you for sharing such a personal story. That's probably the most personal story that I've heard from someone's experience with the residential schools. And I should preface this whole conversation by saying that, we all are products of our experiences. I'm a product of my experience, as are you. And I'm in a learning journey. And so I hope that all the questions that I ask you today and that I brought forward from the staff, they come from a place of wanting to learn and wanting to move forward. And really, it's the only way. As I didn't know, like that story that you just shared, where 5 children, if you lived on the reserve, you had to go, and then your grandparents moved off for the other 3 children, and then that was all changed, and again it was mandatory. So we shared in the pre-call, some of us on these virtual leader chats, that we didn't learn about residential schools. We didn't even know, it wasn't taught us in school. Like, we're just learning this now, and I know it's so painful, but if I can ask you, like, what is the long-term impact of these residential schools in Indigenous peoples in your communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's that I think there's whole university courses that could be taught on that answer to that question, Nicole. No, and I appreciate, and I will be as generous as I can, because I understand, I wasn't taught this either in school. I was taught more about treaties signed in Europe than I was taught about the treaties my literal ancestors signed here, that Canada would not exist without those treaties being signed, as did you, I'm sure, in your school. And I think one of the parts of the accepting that I talked about of that truth is that we have to acknowledge that that was purposeful, that that isn't some error of omission or some, that was actually very purposeful, because they didn't want you to know. They don't want Canadians to know these stories because of this. They make you go, maybe this country isn't that. And we have to, you know, part of it is with Canada, we treat it as this very old thing. It's not. Canada, from a national, from, you know, if you looked at it as a nation, is an infant, right? So the Anishinaabe Nation, of which I'm a member of, we've been on these lands, the lands I sit today in Ontario, through a lot of the Midwest of the US. We've been on these lands for 13,000 years. Canada is, I think we're going into what, 154?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a bit of a difference. I mean, I'm not great at math, but I think there's one that's like way, way more than the other one. And so part of the challenge is when nations are very young, all nations do this. They tell stories about how they came into being, right? About how, and that helps define who they are, to give you a national identity. Well, so Canada's still today in 2021, very much in the process of defining and finding what its national identity is. So as part of that process, and we see this in the US, and that country's literally being torn apart by it, but frankly, we see the same thing in all colonial, what would be politically might be described as colonial children states or settler states like Canada, right? States that were, countries that were created out of European colonialism 500 years ago. There's a whole bunch of them all over around the world. It is the number one changing dynamic that has shaped where we live globally and so many other things. They all struggle with this because they're all young countries trying to define themselves. And what young country wants to start by saying, we came to these lands, there were already people here, there were already nations way older than us here with sophisticated political and economic systems and legal systems, like all of that was here. We signed agreements with them. We didn't uphold any of those agreements. We also like moved them forcibly. We, you know, all of this stuff. We took their children away from them so they couldn't learn their own languages and cultures. And oh, thousands of them died in these schools. And, you know, that's not the national story that Canada wants to tell. So it doesn't. It keeps it out of the history books. It kept, you know, this is why I often say, you said I'm at the beginning, I am chair of the Canada Council for the Arts, the first Indigenous person to ever hold that position. When the Canada Council for the Arts was founded in 1957, Indigenous art practice was not eligible. If you wanted to get a grant to be an artist and you were Indigenous, you had to be performing in a European art form, in ballet or classical music, or it was a tool of assimilation, right? Wow. It was to force us to not practice our own cultures. So they don't want these stories to be told. So we have to acknowledge that. And that means part of the correction for that is that we need to tell way different stories. We need to teach kids way different things. And a lot of this is happening. Yes, it also means maybe we don't have the same statues that we used to, because it turns out maybe those are honoring one part of the story, but not the full story. And even for those who want those things to teach history, do they teach a full piece of history, or do they teach you a specific part of it that they want you to remember but not know any of the other part? So that is part of what we have to acknowledge as we do this work, is that these stories were purposefully kept. I would also say, like, I've never met a First Nations person. This is how deep residential schools went. I've never met one who doesn't have a connection to them. Um, so we all do, is sort of the truth at this point, because that's how deep it went. And that you talked about what it affects in the history. And I think this is actually a key point as we consider it, which is, so when my grandmother went into the school, she only spoke Anishinaabemowin. She only spoke Ojibwe. And she knew our stories, even though she had started to be raised in the church, as I said, my grandparents. So, and they trusted the nuns who would take care of her at the school. So she went in, and you were forbidden to speak anything but English in the school. They cut her hair immediately. They took her clothes. They put her in sackcloth clothes. And if you did speak Anishinaabe, and this is what she would tell me, they would make you stand at the front of the class and stick out your tongue, and the nuns would hit your tongue with a ruler. Or if it was in the winter, they would make you stick your tongue to the flagpole outside of the school, so it would freeze to the flagpole. Or they would hit you with their shoe. The nuns, that's what she said anyway. So by the time she came out of the school, she spent 10 years in the school, from the time she was 6 till she was 16. She was allowed to go home during the summer, so that all the photos I have is her of a child of her during the summer, because that's the only time that she was at home. So when she came out, she did not speak her language really ever again in her life. She did not practice the traditional ways of our people or her parents. She's buried today in a Catholic cemetery, so I go see her at a Catholic cemetery here in Ontario. The key part of why I'm telling you this is because residential schools were less about what they did to her and more about the outcomes for her family, which is, I did not grow up with my language. I did not grow up in my community. I did not grow up with my culture. I've had to discover or work to reclaim all of that as an adult. I grew up in Toronto. You know, I absolutely visited my community. I have family to this day there. I have a very deep connection with that place, but did not grow up there. That was the goal of residential school. It was to make sure that I didn't speak my language or know my ways, that my children wouldn't speak their language and know their ways. This was about, you know, we call it cultural genocide because we don't want to talk about just outright deaths, but it was an attempt to wipe us out so that I wouldn't know who I was, and so that there wouldn't be, in the end, because this is the goal, is that in the end, even though they broke all the treaties, Canada is terrified of the treaties because in them they show the true origins of this place. They show the obligations it should have lived up to, and they expose that maybe this place isn't as legitimate as it wants or claims to be. So their goal throughout all of this has to try to narrow or diminish the number of treaty rights holders, the people on the other side, my community, who can say, because now I have a card, if I had my wallet, I could show you a card from the government that says I'm a treaty rights holder. And ultimately, they would hope that I wouldn't know that. If residential schools had truly worked, I wouldn't know, my kids wouldn't know, and eventually there will be no more treaty rights holders. So Canada can just be free of any obligations it has under the treaties. That's what they were after. It didn't work. We survived. The reality is that's what Canada now has to deal with, is that the strategies that it employed to rid itself of the Indian problem failed. And that's why it worried about its legitimacy today, just as it was back then. The only way to resolve those concerns is to actually have the conversations that should have happened when the country was formed in the first place, which is, can newcomers to this country form a political body on lands that are actually governed by that's the discussion we need to have. And the amazing thing is, I think First Nations are here for that discussion. My ancestors didn't drive anyone away. They welcomed people. This was not viewed as an invasion. And yet it's worked out for us so poorly. And I think so many of us are still trying to get us to a place where Canada will just live up to what it had originally said, so that the vision that our ancestors had of a place could actually live. That's the long-term effects. It means that my family still struggles to reconcile that past, that all that it has meant to us. But I would also say it has ensured, in a weird way, it has made the mission of those schools impossible, because I know what my family went through. I know what my grandmother lived through, and it's not something I learned in a book. You're right, Nicole. I didn't need to, because it was cooking me breakfast in the morning. She was right there. I could reach out and touch her. And in a weird way, that's a it is not a weird way. That is a privilege that I knew her. It would have been a privilege for the rest of Canada to know her, because then maybe we wouldn't have these same sorts of discussions, because then everyone else would have grown up with it in their kitchen. And that's ultimately sort of what we need, is that baseline Canadians understand that this is the history, and that that is something that requires work every day. And we're not there yet, but we're in a place that I don't think my grandmother would have ever envisioned. You know, she didn't live long enough, and I don't know if she would have testified at the TRC. They destroyed all the records for the Spanish schools when they closed in 1967. So we don't actually, they don't have, we know the priests and nuns, but we don't know all the student roles. It wasn't talked about in our family because, well, I think it's obvious why it wouldn't have been a topic for discussion in the family. She and I spoke about it exactly once in the kitchen of my childhood home when I was probably about 10. And it's a conversation that I will never forget. And this is what this is why we need educators to do this, and why we just need it in media. That's why I fight around storytelling, because we Indigenous peoples need Canadians to actually just know this, so that when we meet to discuss the issues, it doesn't require reliving all of this history, that you also come to that circle knowing and come with the obligations that that history should now carry for Canada.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Well, let's talk about truth and reconciliation. I mean, the commission was executed in 2015, 94 calls to action, and many of them surround education. And but only 10 have actually been met. So what do you think is actually preventing? What are some of the barriers for us making further progress on those 94 calls to action?
Yeah, I mean, I think 10 is probably generous. It depends on how you want to count them. I think what's always prevented all of this, because the findings of the TRC were also not news to our communities, and in fact they shouldn't have been news to Canada. There was something called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that was made public in 1996 that listed many of the same things and many of the same path or solutions or possible pathways to resolution that the TRC did. That report was shelved. So I think what's missing is the same thing that was missing in 1996, the same thing that was been missing all along, which is the political will. And I do use the word political because I think this is one of the darkest parts, is that politically it has not always been favorable to actually do this work, because it comes with enormous cost, right? It comes, and not just economic, although it does come with enormous economic cost. But it comes with what is the incentive for a prime minister to engage in a discussion that might require a questioning of the very country he's the prime minister of? Not a lot, right? Like, there's not a lot of incentive to do that. And I think one of the challenges we're seeing in recent times, and again, one of the hopeful things I would put on, is that for Canadians who aren't politicians, you and I, or, you know, I think there's an increasing desire to fix this, to resolve this. But the challenge is, what can the average Canadian do? It really exists outside of your power, except for giving the political will to politicians. And by that, I mean forcing them to, they have to have the courage to do this. And we do that by making sure that they never get to skate on these questions. And I'm not referring to any political specific party, because I lump them all together when it comes to this, is that none of them are come up with a real position of how to actually do this. Some of them will talk a great game, but they don't actually come up with the framework, the political will to do this. And I'll use this example. The Indigenous, and it's, again, I just speak from my personal experience because that's the way I can. I run something called the Indigenous Screen Office. It's a relatively new organization. It's been around since 2017, when it was announced on this day, or right around this day, by that federal heritage minister. It was announced after 25 years of advocacy from TV and filmmakers who just wanted Indigenous stories to be seen on Canadian screens by us, made by us, because there have been stories, but often not made by us. And so after all that advocacy, it's announced. We're not given very much money. $235,000 was the initial budget. So there you go. That's what they gave us. Fast forward to just this last budget that was passed. We got some money from the government, $40 million over 3 years. It was less than half of what we requested. Similar organizations, so Telefilm and the Canadian Media Fund, which do the similar things to the Indigenous Screen Office, but for all Canadians, they got exactly what they asked for, and in some cases more than what they asked for the government. Yes, movies and TV are a trite example, but it is part of a pattern that we see in Canada, where Indigenous people make requests about what we need to help our own communities do things to get measures of equality, and we are given less than what we ask for, or that is needed to actually do what needs to happen. And so we are put into a place of resource scarcity all the time. Our communities, like, you know, some of our communities haven't had drinking water. My community didn't have drinking water for 17 years in modern Canada. This was only resolved, I think, 6 years ago, right? That's modern day Canada. Like, that's not, plumbing was resolved by the Romans. Infrastructure like that is not complex. It is expensive, but it's not exactly complex. What's missing is the political will to put the huge price tag on this, knowing that a whole bunch of Canadians will then scream and shout that we can't do it. So they don't. So I get half while someone else gets exactly what they asked for. We need Canadians, because, again, First Nations people, our Indigenous communities, have been saying this for a very long time. It is clear Canada does not really care that much about listening to us. They do care about listening to you, though, right? Especially big real estate companies. That, if one thing, Canada was literally built as a real estate company. Like, that's what it was. If you go back and look at the British North American Act, as a real estate and export company, was literally why Canada was founded. You have great power. They love to listen to real estate or developers. You tell them, you say, yeah, we don't want to do this on land that is under dispute, which is literally all of it. So can you, and we don't want to be, why should we have to suffer? Because you're a company, or companies or industries that are going to look bad because they're abiding by Canadian law. That is what people are now getting upset about. So ask Canada to resolve this. That's what we need Canadians to do. We may need Canadians to form new political parties to do this. We have to admit that some of these aren't ever going to do that. So maybe If it's important to you, that's not no one you can support. Like that's what we need. We need a fundamental redefinition, and that's what I think is missing is the political will. The last thing I would say, Nicole, that, and I've been saying this a lot these past few weeks, is that, and this is true of political will too, but it's also true of the economics, is we need to see Canada invest into Indigenous futures the way, with the same abundance, vigor, and precision in which it invested in taking our futures from us. And that was a multi-generational, multi-billion, and think of the political will it took to set up a residential school system, to fund it, to do all of this. Think of the political will it took to ignore the reports, to do all of that. That's what you have to demand, is like, if they went through all of that to set the system up, we got to go through all of that to correct what that system produced. And what that system produced is a generation or multiple generations of people that don't know their language, don't know their culture. There should be enormous, unprecedented investment into Indigenous language education for Indigenous peoples, getting all of our culture back, like enormous that you've never seen, because that what was expressly taken. That's what we should be asking the government. And like, yeah, that's where we are asking basically for 154 years of reversing. That's right. It's a big ask. What has Canada asked of First Nations people? They've asked that we literally sacrifice our children for this place. I think it's okay to ask for political solutions to the reality of that.
Lots to unpack there, and you're right. Where there's a will, there's a way, but there needs to be a lot of political will there. I want to talk about one more thing federally. Just this year, on September 30th, which we know as Orange Shirt Day, we're now going to recognize for the very first time National Day of Truth and Reconciliation as a statutory holiday. What do you think the sentiment is here with this?
I mean, I think it's good. You know, I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister a few weeks ago and asked for there to be a day of remembrance. Because I think those sorts of, you know, listen, are they performative? Sure. You know, all of that is true. But they provide opportunities. I would say this even of Canada Day, right? Like, what is Canada Day? It's a celebration for some. For others, it's an opportunity to say something. I think all of that is good and should be accepted, right? If you want to celebrate Canada Day, someone protesting it should be part of what you're celebrating, quite honestly. When it comes to moments of remembrance, because we have other moments of remembrance where we take a moment, this is a moment Canadians should probably be taking, to be honest, and probably for a very long time. And so I think it's good. I think what you'll hear from a lot of folks from our communities is the day is good. We'll always take it. Of course, I'm someone who would always advocate in general for a 4-day work week, all full stop, but any day off is good. A day to reflect is good. We need a lot of reflection about a lot of things, I would say right now. So taking a day to do that, and we're not often afforded the time, so taking a day to do that. But that reflection must lead to action. That we can reflect and acknowledge and do all of those things. There has to be something that comes after. Because if all we're going to do is take a day and wear our orange shirts and reflect, but then go the next day and do exactly what we were doing, then what was the outcome? What were we really reflecting on? And so I'm all for reflection. I'm someone who tries to carve as much time as I can for that. So that's good. But when I do it, it's meant to then inform my actions. So I think that's what we are looking for, is let's have the day, let's reflect, and then let's do something about what needs to be resolved. And so much needs to be resolved. But we can't let the so much bury us or cause the inaction that we've already seen. Doing nothing is the worst. Let's do something. And so I'm all for it, and I'm all for what will come, what I hope will come out of it. And I hope all of this news has just given Canadians an opportunity to go through that grieving process and come out with the determination to having reflected, to do something different. Because my dad's side of the family, they came to this country because they came from America to Canada because they thought it would be better. So I understand that the dreams that Canadians have for this place and what they want it to be. And we should always point out that criticizing the state is not criticizing of the people, right? All I'm trying to do is have the people understand what the state is, so that maybe the people can change, because the people can change. The people can change companies and organizations and governments, because we're the people. These all things are built around us. And so I understand deeply why we want to fulfill the promise of this place. I also understand it from my grandmother and my great-grandparents' point of view, where they also wanted the promise of this place. So I get it. But I as someone who has these two sides of my family, I've grown up having to reflect on this, and it's informed what you've heard today, what I'll do tomorrow, how I raise my children. I think so I want Canada to be informed in that same way, so that we can actually do this together. I think the true greatness of Canada is resolving this issue. What a thing for Canada actually to work through and to be an example for the rest of the world. And I do think we can do it. We don't have to become what we see south of what the colonial border, where you deny so far that you're hurting yourself. And Canada has denied a lot, and it's hurt itself a lot, but there's still opportunity for it to not. And boy, do I have the same hopes and dreams. If not for me, for my kids who are upstairs learning in remote like everyone else, and can't wait for the school year to end and summer to start and all of that. But they want this country to work for them. I want it to work for them. They're going to be here. So I'm all here for it. I'm all in on it. But I think that the part is that we reflect on it, that we don't hide this stuff anymore, because the reality is it's not going to be hidden. It's not going to be hidden. I'll tell you a very quick story. My son's a young man. Sometimes he uses his phone too much. So we recently, he got caught with his phone, but he denied it. He was like, "Oh, no, I don't have my phone." And I said, "Well, what if I called your phone? Would I find that you do have it?" And he was like, "Yeah, you can call it." So I called his phone, and of course he had his phone. He'd wrapped it up and hidden it. And we had the discussion where I said, "Listen, if you just handed the phone, it was the lying that I didn't like as a parent. The phone itself, we can work through that part. Just don't lie to me about it." This is the thing, right? Like, Canada can't hide this stuff, right? These graves we always knew they were there. The community knew this and had told the government years ago in Kamloops where these were. My community knows that there are children there. We have the phone, right? We can call it. It's going to ring in Canada's pocket. So I think what we're asking is, can we have the adult conversation, not the one with the 13-year-old who's trying to do 13-year-old things and trying to hide it and Canada to leap into a mature moment and meet us there, where we can all acknowledge the truth and move forward. That's my big hope.
Oh, that's great. So there, in your story with your son, there's the act, and then there's the lying about the act versus the truth about the act. So I think that's really important. And I also really loved that you talked about reflection and it not just being a moment. And so I think that's really important because at MPAC, we're going through our own equity, diversity, and inclusion journey. And I would tell you, our staff are telling us, so I'm hearing you when you're saying this, they don't want this to just be a moment. They don't want it to be check the box. They don't want it to be we're doing this because we should do it. It's the corporate thing to do. They want to see change. And so in order to do change, we have to have these hard conversations. We have to learn, we have to grieve. I really liked your analogy of grieving. And one of the things that we're talking about with DiversaPro, who's our consultants, is incorporating land acknowledgements into our regular practice at MPAC. And had I asked that question of you at the beginning of this conversation, I think, we probably wouldn't have had the same appreciation for it. But could you just put in your own words the importance of land acknowledgements?
Sure. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion around them. So first, I would say where they come from. So I'll do that part first. If you've ever been, and I realize for many non-Indigenous Canadians they haven't, but take it from me. If you come to an Indigenous gathering where many people from all over are gathered, the land acknowledgements you hear are a bit of a reflection of how we introduce ourselves. So I would introduce myself saying I'm Jessie Wente, I'm Anishinaabe, from born and raised in Toronto. My dad's family comes from Chicago. My mom's side of the family comes from Ganabajing. I'm a member of the Serpent River First Nation. I'm Bear Clan. And I may, depending on the setting, go even further and say, my grandmother is Norma Miyawasaki. My great-grandparents are Alex and Maggie Miyawasaki. Like, through this whole long introduction, and literally everyone will do it. And the reason we do that is to expose or understand our relationships to one another and the relationships of our nations that may be historical. So because again, my nation's been here for 13,000 years. All the other First Nations have also been here a very, very long time. We have a long history together, right? We all met before Canada was ever a thing, right? So if I say that and I'm introduced to someone, oh, okay, I know you, maybe we'll even realize we're cousins. Like, it can literally be about a relationship, but we can certainly realize very literally where everyone is coming from, who they are, situate themselves in history, in family, in community, so that now everyone knows who everyone is, where they're coming from. Now we can actually discuss what we all came to meet with that knowledge already there. We've already started to identify the relationships we have. And if we were to be on someone else's territory, we would acknowledge that. We would say, I'm a visitor to this place. Thank you so much for having us. So land acknowledgements are sort of an extension of that. I would say they should typically be done by non-Indigenous people, because it's weird. Like, I used to do them, but then I sort of realized, like, when I do them in Toronto, I'm literally acknowledging like my own people, which is just weird. I can acknowledge the Haudenosaunee, the Huron, Wendat, because that's not my nation. But when then I get to the Anishinaabe, it's like, I don't acknowledge that I'm in my own house, right? Like, it's just a weirdness. So they should, but the key part to them, if you're going to do them, is that they should be representative of a relationship that you have, right? Because that's what I'm doing when I'm introducing myself. I'm bringing my relationship so that I can understand my relationships with everyone else. So so if you're going to do them, they should be suggestive. And if you don't have the relationship, I don't know if you're ready for the acknowledgement yet, right? So you need to build the relationship. You should always try to get the names actually right. I sort of cringe sometimes when I hear weird pronunciations, because again, if we were to introduce ourselves, Nicole, it would be weird if you say, hi, I'm Nicole, and then I call you Steve. Like, that would be weird. So trying to get the names right. But yes, I know there's a lot of debate about, they can be performative or whatever. Yeah, they can. I guess I would say, like, we haven't been doing them that long. So why don't we keep going for a while and see where we can land on a comfort? Because even since we've been doing them, they've evolved. They're getting more specific, which I think is great. That's the point. they're starting to identify relationships, which is great. But just to give you another story, it is about my son. I promise not all my stories are about my son. It just so happens that this one is, he went to school. He's not a big, he loves his phone, less school. And he went to school, I want to say this was in grade maybe 6. So it's few years ago, back when the TDSB started to actually do a landing. And so he went in for his first day of school, and, first day of school, some kids are excited. My kids are, not. So he went in, but he came home and he was excited. And he came in and he's like, Dad, we were in class and the school day was starting, and on the announcements, they did an acknowledgement and they said Anishinaabe. And he was so proud and happy in that moment because, and I thought, when I went to school, and I went to a private school for the most part in Toronto, I was absolutely the only, I was the only Indigenous kid to have ever gone there, and might still be. But certainly at the time, was the only Anishinaabe kid in that school, the only he is likely also the only Anishinaabe kid in his public school here in Toronto. For performance or whatever it may have been, if it was a performance, that performance made my child feel welcome at school for maybe the first time in his life. And if that's what did it, I'm not someone who can tell you not to do land acknowledgements, because if it means that the employee or the staff member or a community member who's in it hears it and feels seen or welcome for whatever time, just feels welcome, I got to say that's worth it. Because one of the weirdnesses, as my as Elder Duke Redbird would say to me, one of the weirdnesses about being Indigenous in 2021 is we're on the lands our families have been on for so long, and yet so often we find ourselves unwelcome on them. And that is weird, like deeply weird to a core. And yet, so to find that in a space, in a school, we've just spent the last time talking about a pretty damaging history of schools with Indigenous peoples. For him to feel like that, do your best with the land acknowledgements. I think they're a good thing in the end. Yes, they can be performative. Yes, I wish everyone had a relationship with these communities and all of that stuff. But even in the performance, if that's the effect it can have, it's worth it.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story. I mean, we do have a lot of Indigenous staff, and we're spread right across Ontario, 27 different offices. So you think about all the land acknowledgement there.
Yeah, that's a lot.
I want to thank you so much for joining. We're out of time, but it was such a great chat. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I think we are all moved, and I think we are all we're coming away learning and understanding more. And I encourage everyone to read the 94 calls to action, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and absolutely, I just want to thank you again for your time and for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thanks to everyone for attending. And I really appreciate the opportunity, and have a lovely day.
Thank you. And for all of you on the line, just so you know, we won't be having a virtual leader chat next week or the week after. I know that sometimes you get worried when we send those cancellation notes out, but next week, as you know, we have our mini closure. So I wish everyone a fabulous bit of a break, kickstart your vacations, and then we've extended it into the week after again because it's a very popular week of vacations. So we will be back on July 14th, and you'll see an invite going into your calendars. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you, Jessie. It was really, really wonderful. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye, everyone.